as many of you may know, I really love questions. I've always been this way. Do you like questions? Because for me, questions are an essential tool to just accessing your curiosity. When I was a little kid, I was always that kid in the classroom that was always like, why? Annoying his parents with why, how. And I remember in middle school, I was nicknamed Socrates by a couple of teachers. I had my friends called me Random Dave because I would seamlessly go from one topic to another without any smooth transition. I just want to know and keep asking questions. And Voltaire once said, to judge a man by his questions, not by his answers. So, my fellow Toastmasters and honored guests, tonight you will learn how to ask better questions and carry on interesting conversations that will never fall flat. Now, you may be thinking, David, there's no such thing as a bad question. There's only bad answers. Well, I would completely disagree with that because think back to a time that you had a great conversation, that you just got lost in it and you forgot the time. Now, think back to a time when you had a horrible conversation where it immediately fell flat and that awkward silence instantly emerged and you're like, all right, what do we do now? What do these two conversations have in common? Questions. It is the questions. And this idea that you should assume the burden the next time you have a conversation. The next time you have a conversation, you meet someone new, you're on an interview, or you're just talking to a friend or a parent, assume the burden of the conversation. Now, what does assume the burden mean? It means take the responsibility that not only do you have to carry the conversation, but whatever you contribute to the conversation, it's your imperative to make sure that they're as interesting as possible. There's no such thing as boring people, just boring questions. If you thinking back to your interesting conversation that you really got lost into, think back to those emotions that you had. You probably felt special. You probably felt like you were being listened to and that it was just seamless. Your answers were just flowing out and it didn't even feel like an interview, even though questions were clearly being asked. Imagine the conversations you would have if you approached every conversation where it was your goal to make that other person feel like the most interesting person in the room. This is a technique often used by radio host interviewers, and one of the benefits of doing this is you control the frame of the conversation. If you assume the burden, you literally have the absolute power to direct the entire conversation. Now, this is one of those things with great strength comes great responsibility, because this is also the same technique that interrogators do. For example, Maggie, how could you act so irresponsibly? Is there a right answer to this?
No.
Is there a way to frame this
Only
positively?
shame.
Yeah.
Only
We don't even know what she did, or if there is even anything wrong. But that conversation was definitely going bad down the rabbit hole. Or Zena, based on your vast amounts of experience and your work ethic, what can I do to have as much success as you? Is there a wrong answer to that? No. We don't even know what she's great at or what she's accomplished. But but I can tell you that Zena, you already can see from her expression that she's ready to give all the advice. Now, what's interesting about this is you all can remember any time that you've received. Who in here remembers the time that they've gotten unsolicited advice? Yep. People just want to give advice, just tell you things. And that's because you're playing on this human tendency to to assume that you're really smart and knowledgeable and everyone wants to hear what you say, even though we're horrible judges of that. So, assume the responsibility. Now, you may be thinking, how do I construct a great question? Well, there are some simple tips that you can do to construct a really good question so you can have seamless conversations. First thing you can do, Ask open-ended questions. We've all heard this advice. That means ask questions that don't end in a one-part answer. Instead of, hi, how are you? Or what day is it? You can say, oh man, did you see that car outside? Or you ask questions that have more how and why in it. Now, how many people in here have felt that they've had conversations that seemed like they were flowing, but it felt more like an interview? You might have felt this on a first date, or meeting someone for the first time and you were trying to get through that awkward barrier. And that's because even though how and why are great ways to initiate open-ended questions, they seem very interviewy up front, and it's easy to detect. So I recommend using what I call camouflage words. Instead of saying how and why, say, describe to me, tell me about a time. Or the dreaded why. Like you go through your whole spiel after answering the question, then they just stop you with the, oh, why? And it just kind of kills the whole conversation. Instead of why, say, tell me more. I'm interested. It doesn't sound like an interview anymore. Now it's just a flowing conversation. And if you can't think of any good question on the spot, one of the best trump cards is turn questions into statements. It's one of the best things to fall back on. And this works for any question. Instead of, Denise, where are you from? I could say, Denise, you look like a New Yorker. Or Bill, you look like you work in finance, instead of, what do you do? It makes a much more interesting conversation, and it actually it shows interest in the other person. Another thing is, don't make sure when you direct the conversation that you're paying obviously you're paying close attention to what they're saying. That way you can build off the conversation. So, Zena, Zena, you look like you had a rough day.
I didn't.
You didn't have a rough day.
I didn't.
Just tell it on.
Zena, you look like you had a rough day because you were late.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was stuck in traffic.
Stuck in traffic. It's another thing to build upon, where you can say, these are all exercises that you also that also are taught in professional improvisers. Finally, a great technique is adding contextual statements, or just a little bit of build-up for an interesting question. And this can go in either a positive or a negative way, and you can do this with comments too. So instead of asking, how did you like lunch? You could say, man, if you had lunches like that every day, don't you think we would have world peace by now? Much more interesting question. Now you can turn on the flip side. If you didn't like that lunch, man, if I had a prison camp, I would feed those to the prisoners every day, wouldn't you? It seems exaggerated, but that's what makes for interesting conversation. That's what makes comedy funny. So, the next time you find yourself conversating with someone, first date, interview, meeting people for the first time, and you're feeling that awkwardness, or you're trying to break the ice, remember, assume the burden. Remember that you can ask questions. Questions can have no answers, but no answers can have no. But no answer can have. There can't be answers without questions.
Well done.